You might think a high sensitivity assay is always good, but is it always? In order to answer that question, I need to explain how these tests work. There are quite a few ways to measure for the presence of a particular antibody, but among the simplest is what's called a sandwich assay, or ELISA. Now, this is not a chemistry video, but very briefly, the test starts with a substrate coated with a protein that looks like the surface of the virus you're interested in. The noncellular component of a patient's blood is then made to flow over the surface. The serum, as it's called, has antibodies or IgG molecules to all the pathogens that the patient has been exposed to. If the patient has had a COVID infection, some of the serum antibodies will stick to the surface. The final step is then to flow a solution of another antibody that will bind to any IgG molecule on the surface. If there is no COVID antibody on the surface, none of this second antibody will bind, at least theoretically. Importantly, this second antibody has a special property, and that is colored, or that it can be made to fluoresce. That means you can detect whether it binds to the surface just by using light. So how do we determine the sensitivity and specificity? So let's say I take 1,000 blood samples from recovered COVID patients, and you run it through the test. I'll also test 1,000 blood samples taken before December 2019. These will be negative as the virus was only emerging at that time. Now let's just look at the results for the true positive samples. Each one of these samples is going to have different amounts of COVID antibody. Not everybody is the same, and not everybody has the same immune response. So you don't expect to get the exact same amount of antibody in each patient. So the way we can describe this is as a histogram. So I'm plotting the number of patients or number of times I saw a specific amount of light. Now let's see what happens with the true negatives. Now the first thing you might ask is, hey, wait a minute, why should I see any light? If this COVID antibody was not present, then there should be no reason for the reporter molecules to bind to the surface, and they should be washed away. So the reality is that these reporter molecules can non-specifically absorb to the surface. In other words, they just kind of stick to it. And other factors that can play into this is just the instrument itself. It just doesn't report zero accurately. There's some sort of background, where all these things together give you a distribution that looks like this. Now I think you can see what the problem is here, is that these two curves overlap. We have to decide on the criteria for a test being positive. So let's see here. Let's say I assign this amount of light as my criteria. Any test that I see more than this critical amount of light, I'm going to call positive. And any test that's less than that amount of light, I'm going to call negative. But of course, these areas that I've shaded here are the problem. So let's look at this blue area. That's actually the number of true negative samples that exceeded our criteria. In other words, this blue area represents false positives. Likewise, this red area are false negatives. Now, sensitivity is the true positive rate. So that concerns this red curve. The percentage of area under this curve that exceeds the criteria is the sensitivity. The specificity is kind of the opposite. It's the area under this true negative curve that's less than the criteria I've established. So the larger the false positives, the area under here, the lower my specificity is. Now I can choose my criteria at any point here. So let's say I choose it farther to the right. And by doing that, of course, I've increased the specificity. In other words, the area that I would shade in blue now is this tiny little bit down here. The percentage of the true negative samples that I would classify as negative has increased by moving my criteria to the right. But you can see the cost of that, because now the sensitivity, which is the area under the true positive curve, has decreased, right? In other words, this area here as a percentage of the entire area under the true positive curves has decreased as I move this to the right. So the point is, if I decrease the sensitivity by moving this criteria to the right, I will actually increase the specificity. And you often see this in analytical tests, is that there's a give and take between sensitivity and specificity. And you can manipulate that by just changing your criteria. So back to the question, how sensitive should these tests be? Well, that has to do with the predictive value. Okay, so now let's go back to our original criteria and now run some unknown samples, just 1,000 patients in the general population, and we'll assume that the prevalence is around 5%. Here's our 5% prevalence. Now you recall in the last video about predictive value, we chose a test that was 95% sensitive and 90% specific, sort of like these curves. You can see that the area under that are false negatives is smaller than that are false positives, and it's sort of reflected here. So the criteria for this test was chosen something like this. Now, with a 5% prevalence, you have to be careful, right? The curve, this represents a population where there's 50% prevalence of positive and negative, right? We took 1,000 true positive samples and 1,000 true negative samples. In the real world, with a 5% prevalence, the area under this positive curve is going to be way lower. So this whole curve will shift down. It'll have the same breadth. But you can see what happens is the area of positive in the 5% prevalent case begins to be dominated by the area that's false positive. And that's why we found the positive predictive value was only 34%. The negative predictive value is quite good. It was 99.8%. And that's reflective of the fact that the area underneath this false negative contribution is a lot smaller than this curve. So now let's move our criteria to the right. I'm going to decrease the sensitivity by moving this to the right. So this area under the red curve gets larger, and that means this area gets smaller. That means that you've decreased the sensitivity. But I got the benefit of an increased specificity by moving to the right. The area under this little bit here is super small compared with this area. So by moving it to the right, I've decreased the sensitivity. I went from, let's say, 95% to 80%. I've increased the specificity to 99% because now the area under this blue curve here is only 1% of all the area under this entire blue curve. If I apply the sensitivity and specificity to the 5% prevalence, as we did in the last video, it turns out the positive predictive value now has raised to 81%. The negative predictive value has decreased, but you can see it's still 99%. So it's pretty clear that high sensitivity tests here are not what you want, particularly if you want to be able to truly identify just how many people are positive. One thing that can be done is to accept a low sensitivity just to make sure you have a very high specificity. Hope this helps.